Lies, lies, and more lies. That's what we're going to discuss today. I'm Stephen Solomon, director of the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute and founding editor of First Amendment Watch, which covers free speech issues. Disinformation is widespread today, exacerbated by social media. It is now widely known that Russians interfered with the 2016 presidential election. More recently, the 2020 presidential election involved numerous false claims about voting fraud. Disinformation is not confined to the political arena. Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones used his website InfoWars to make repeated claims that the murder of 20 children and 6 adults at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut was a giant hoax. Scientific matters can also be the subject of widespread lies. Since the beginning of the pandemic, disinformation about the virus has flourished. Among a handful of false claims is that the virus can be treated with bleach and that vaccines alter people's DNA. Fighting disinformation is more complex in the United States than in other countries because of the First Amendment. And that's what our very distinguished panel will discuss in the next hour. After the panelists delve into these issues, we'll open it up for questions. And now to introduce our panelists. Salman Rushdie is our faculty colleague here at the NYU's Carter Journalism Institute. As you know, he is a novelist and essayist who has written 14 novels and 4 works of nonfiction. His books have been translated into 40 languages. One of his novels, Midnight's Children, won the Booker Prize and was deemed to be the best novel of all winners on 2 occasions, marking the 25th and 40th anniversary of the prize. The recipient of numerous accolades, Professor Rushdie is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2007, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his service to literature. He has been a distinguished writer in residence at the Carter Journalism Institute since 2015. Jameel Jaffer is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. The Institute is a major center of First Amendment scholarship and litigation and has an influential voice in debates about freedom of speech in the digital age. Before joining the Knight Institute as its founding executive director in 2016, Jaffer served as deputy legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union, where he oversaw work on free speech, privacy, technology, national security, and human rights. He litigated some of the most significant post-9/11 cases involving human rights and national security. He led or co-led litigation teams, including one that compelled the National Security Agency to stop its surveillance of Americans' call records. Larry Siems is the chief of staff at the Knight First Amendment Institute. He helps guide its program strategy and planning. Siems' career in human rights and free expression advocacy includes 17 years directing freedom to write and international programs for PEN, the International Writers Organization. At PEN, he designed and coordinated global campaigns to protect writers and defend the right of freedom of expression. And he supported the efforts of writers in more than a dozen countries to defend their freedom of speech. Siems has been published widely on human rights and free expression. His work has appeared in the New York Times and many other leading publications. Now, while you're listening to our panelists, you can think about the questions you might ask them at the end. Please tweet questions for our panelists at NYU_journalism, and we will ask them during the Q&A portion of the event. Or to ask questions via live stream, log in and post them to the chat. Thanks very much, and I'm going to turn it over to the panel.
Okay, well, first of all, Jameel, Larry, thank you so much for making the way downtown from that other university.
We're very happy to get the invitation. Thank you.
And I thought if we're going to talk about lies, we might just begin by talking about truth, which is also a problem. We live in an age in which truth is globally a very contested thing. One man's Jewish homeland is another person's Palestinian homeland, and those things are almost incompatible. I mean, where I come from, there's a part of my homeland, Kashmir, which is in the possession of Pakistan and is referred to in Pakistan as Free Kashmir. The same area is referred to in India as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So what I'm saying is that it's not easy to agree on what is the truth against which the lie operates. And I'm just wondering if you have any kind of definition of what you consider to be truth that you're defending against lies.
I'm going to jump in that right away and defend lies to begin with. I was a born liar. You know, that was
That was your skill?
that was my skill. I
Your superpower?
I was good at it. It was a necessary skill, I think, because I think for a lot of people, in lies are freedom. In some ways, they're a way of breaking out of constraints. They allow you to be places where you're not supposed to be, do things that you're not supposed to do, and so I think, you know, that when you talk about truth, you're posing the idea that truth is often tyrannical, you know, and so I'm counterposing the idea that lies are a way toward freedom for, you know, outside of those structures. I think the challenge becomes, as you mature, you know, there's really an ethic of truth-telling. You know, why the truth is the question. Why do we value the truth over lies? And I guess I would say from my experience, you know, that lying is fine, it's good, it's liberating, up until the point that your lies are damaging to other people. You know, I think this is the process of the personal experience of fiction and truth. If you do something and somebody else is going to go to jail for it, and you let that person go to jail for it in order to maintain your lie, you're a shitty person, you know. And so I think for me, when you know, the necessity of truth is born from that moment where the freedom that lying gives you, or the freedom of imagination, the freedom to create the space you want to be in, runs up against the reality of other people.
Harm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where to start. So I guess one place to start is just with this question of whether we're focused on the right topic. So, you know, we all agreed that we were going to focus on lies, but having agreed to focus on lies, now I wonder, you know, are we contributing to the kind of overestimation of lies as the real problem in our society right now? I mean, I think that there is this sense that misinformation is a hugely significant problem right now, that our political problems are traceable, at least in significant part, to the problem of misinformation. And I am not entirely convinced that that's, you know, that's true. First, you know, obviously lies have been around forever, not just lies, but very damaging lies. You know, if you think about the lies that have been most damaging to the United States, the lies you would put at the top of your list, I think, probably predate social media. And they don't come from the margins. They come from the most powerful people. Maybe the, you know, weapons of mass destruction might be an easy example, but I might put the Obama administration's statements about the drone campaign, or you know, previous administration statements about the war in Southeast Asia. You know, those are lies that have really shaped or distorted our democracy and our world. And those obviously predated all the technological issues that we associate with the problem of misinformation right now. So that's one reason why, you know, I'm a little bit skeptical of the focus on lies. You know, another reason is the one you sort of allude to, Salman, which is just that, you know, even if you think lies are a problem, you know, if that's the problem, like what is the solution that's not worse than the, you know, the original disease? And for that reason too, I kind of worry about the focus on lies.
Yeah, do you think that the new information technology changes the game? I mean, that's to say, that the way in which lies can spread now is so much more powerful, and that that on the internet, lies and truth look exactly the same. They have exactly the same kind of design status. It's very hard to tell them apart. So does it make it a new problem because of new technology?
We just had a conference about this at the Knight Institute at Columbia, and one of the panels had several social scientists and historians, and I would say their consensus was that this has always been an endemic in American culture, especially we are a culture that's very prone to fanciful conspiracy theories. I mean, you think of Huckleberry Finn and the characters in that, the Twain landscape in American literature. I think their consensus was it has been ever thus in American culture. I think that obviously they're amplified. I think they're commercially profitable in a lot of ways, and I think that's an important part of the dynamic of what happens online. You talked about Sandy Hook. There are large commercial operations that the charlatans are, running on their lies, and I think those are, made possible by the medium that they have at their hands. But culturally, I think we've always been a country that has told tall tales.
Isn't it also complicated, even just to focus on the technology? I mean, you're right that technology has definitely changed things, but it's changed things in many different ways. It's hard to know what the bottom line is, because yes, a lie can be distributed much more efficiently with the technology we have today, but it is also true that the lies of the powerful are subject to checks that they weren't subject to 20 years from now, right? 20 years ago. And many of the movements that we think of as, or many of us think of as, correcting deep injustices in our society, deep lies in our society, were made possible by new technology, right? That Black Lives Matter and Me Too, like these are movements that were made possible by social media, or in part by social media.
The Arab Spring.
And the Arab Spring, yeah. And so it's not that I don't think there's anything to the complaint that new technology has presented has made lies more powerful and more, given them more traction. I think that's true, but that's not the only change that has resulted from this technology.
So I guess one of the sort of elephants in the room is the so-called big lie, which resulted from the last election campaign and the outgoing president's insistence that it was a fraudulent election, in spite of there being essentially no evidence that any kind of electoral fraud had been committed. And yet we still, research polling tells us that very large percentages of the Republican voter bank believes the big lie and believes that this is an illegitimate government which stole the election. Now, if we reach that level of damage, damage to the democracy, the question arises whether new limits are necessary. The First Amendment protects certain kinds of things and doesn't protect other kinds of speech. So the question is whether hitherto protected speech, which is political speech, which quite a large amount of leeway is granted, whether we need to re-examine the question of harmful speech in that light. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I understand the instinct. I kind of understand the impulse to crack down on laws of that kind. But when you start thinking about the details of what that regulation would look like and who would actually be wielding the power that regulation would create, I think it quickly becomes less appealing. Like if this power had been available to President Trump, I don't think he would have used this power in the way that we're imagining right now the power, would be used. And you don't know who's going to have that power tomorrow. And even beyond the question of sort of abuse, there's also the question of just getting things wrong. Some of these questions, I wouldn't point to the big lie as an example of this, but some of these questions are deeply contested, and 95% of us are entirely sure we know what the answer is until next week, when suddenly we realize, actually, maybe what we thought about masks last week was not entirely correct, right? And I think that there's real danger in cutting off debate, and I think that there is, even if you could sort of carve out certain categories of speech where we collectively, although put an asterisk next to collectively, who is this collective that comes to this conclusion, but where we collectively agree that there is no room for reasonable debate, I think that kind of power would very easily be abused by officials who wanted to abuse it. And you don't have to speculate about that. You can look around the world at fake news laws, which many countries now have. Look at the way that those fake news laws have been used. They haven't been used for the most part to go after the kinds of people we have in mind when we talk about these kinds of laws here. They've been used to go after political dissidents. Yeah. And I think it would be naive to think that we're immune here in the United States from the possible abuse of that kind of power in the same way.
I think. Sorry. I would say. I did take the position before, but we've always been like this in this country. But I do think that there's a technology of electoral manipulation that's been tested and perfected over the last 20 or 30 years. I think the PEN had its International Congress in Lviv in 2017, and a lot of the speakers there were digital rights activists and human rights activists from the Ukraine, from Europe, who were giving frontlines reports about Russian manipulation of the public discourse in Ukraine, lies, disinformation, and to some extent about the Ukrainians too, Ukrainian troll factories and everything. This has very clearly been happening in the world. The technology offers, because of the ad model, which allows you to target very specifically who your information's going to, how the algorithms collect information and, can build Facebook, channel your ads to potentially sympathetic Nazi audiences or whatever movement building you're doing. I mean, there's a technology deployment that's happening here. But I think, it's really interesting to watch Ukraine as an example, because if there was an attempt by doing this to kind of soften the battlefield in Ukraine over the last 5 to 10 years, I guess we'd have to say that failed. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, go behind the curtain in Russia, where the lies are being generated, and now there's a life behind that wall of lies, apparently, that first of all leads to miscalculation, possibly about the potential of invasion, there's a kind of dangerous isolation to that. So I do think there's a technology that's been deployed, is being deployed, and I think it is consequential, but maybe not in the ways that that we feared they would be directly.
Also, if you look at the classic free speech position, you would say that let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let everybody say everything, and that the answer to speech is other speech, and that would be the kind of John Stuart Mill position. Does that still hold up, or do we think that that's cracking under the pressure of this new avalanche of lies?
I think that Larry made an important point in there about the one aspect of the technology here, which is that the technology of micro-targeting allows people to focus their messages on very small communities and insulate those messages from counter speech, right? As you say, the theory is that somebody says something wrong, somebody else will correct it with something right. But these messages aren't visible to everybody else. The messages are sent just to these small communities, and nobody outside those communities even knows the message has been sent to them. And so this mechanism that we have always assumed will be the corrective to, to evil counsels, right? The remedy to evil counsels is good ones. That remedy isn't allowed to, that remedy isn't possible in this, in this environment. And so I do think that there's room for legislative reform here that would create transparency where there is no transparency now, open up those messages to the possibility of counter speech. You could do that in a number of ways, but one way to do it would be essentially require the platforms to make those messages visible to, make their advertising more visible to users generally. So I don't think that to say that we shouldn't outlaw lies or outlaw a specific categories of lies isn't to say we shouldn't do anything. I mean, there are things we can do. I just think that going down that particular road might be a mistake.
Well, and I think it's sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's a mistake to think of it as entirely an epistemological problem. I don't think what's going on entirely is a winnable war about arriving at the truth. I think there's a lot that's happening now that's about identity groups and conflicts that, the lies are banners rather than actual beliefs in some sense. So I don't think, you're not going to talk people out of their positions on vaccines.
Do you think this is true on the left too, or just on the right?
I think it's true on the. I think it's true on the left to some extent, because I do think that this is a kind of tribal mantles that you wear to some extent. I think it's and I think I live in a rural area now, and it's quite divided, and there really is not the possibility of what we would always have thought of as a kind of Socratic process conversation with people. This is not what's happening. These are, you have your flag literally or figuratively in front of your house. That's who you are. You navigate those conversations with people, understanding the limits of those conversations. But, people have declared their groups. And I think, it is, the lies are meant to divide. I think that's one of the purposes of them. They're a way of sorting ourselves out socially now. And, I worry about, there's a particular quality of lie that I think is, the one that's most alarming, which is the lie that starts to sound a little bit like, what was it, Radio de Mille Collines in Radio Rwanda, where, you're starting to talk about the other as cockroaches. You're starting to talk about, there's a very, very specific kind of way of talking about, and I do think the right does this generally more than the left. They call it, your libtards, your whatever. There's a kind of, socialist. There's a kind of naming and categorizing, but that's starting to bleed now toward, what is it? What is the recruiter one? The pedophile, the groomers. I'm sorry, right? That's moving toward groomers. And when the language starts to move in that direction, which is our lies that are personally identifying people as others who are engaged in, criminal conduct. I mean, this is Putin's justification for Ukraine, right? Their denazification. And so I do think, I do think that's a line that we're, sliding toward. And again, it's not about the truth, obviously, or, the truth in fiction about whether this person is a groomer is an absurd conversation, but that's not what's happening.
For a very long time, I would have thought of myself as pretty much a First Amendment fundamentalist, and just would defend it. I'm being obliged to ask myself in recent years whether that's any longer a defensible position, and since you guys are the First Amendment guys, I wanted to ask, whether, in your opinion, there is room for judgments which create more exceptions. I mean, I saw on your the document you sent me that there was an argument from a First Amendment scholar that, for example, the First Amendment does not protect, I think, public servants speaking as a function of their public service. And so the argument is that if the president is considered a public servant, which he is, he's paid by the state, then nothing he says is protected by the First Amendment. Will that fly?
Well, so I guess I resist this idea that it's the First Amendment that's the obstacle to our doing what we really should do or want to do in this particular sphere. Like, I don't actually, it's hard for me to think of policy proposals that I think of as good ideas that I also think the First Amendment would preclude. I mean, I think that, people have different views of what the First Amendment would preclude, so obviously there's some, room for disagreement here. But, my reason for opposing new laws that criminalize lies isn't that the First Amendment would be an obstacle, but rather that it wouldn't be a good idea. We don't want to. It would be misused. Powerful people would get things wrong, or they would abuse those powers. And I think that that's been proven over and over again in our own history, and it's being proven over and over again around the world right now. But I do think we need to think seriously about the application of these big First Amendment principles or big free speech principles to the context we're living in now. We've been involved in some litigation in Florida and Texas. Those two states have new laws that regulate social media and limit how social media platforms can moderate the content on their platforms. And the social media companies have gone into court saying, this law is unconstitutional, these laws are unconstitutional. We are just like newspapers. We make editorial decisions just like newspapers do. We're protected by the First Amendment just as newspapers are. And for the same reasons that a law that regulated what the New York Times could publish in its pages would be unconstitutional, a law that regulates how we moderate content on our platforms is unconstitutional. And on the other side, you have the states, Florida and Texas, arguing that the social media platforms are not like newspapers. They're like AT&T. They're common carriers. And as common carriers, they have no First Amendment rights to assert in the first place. So you have these two, in my view, extreme visions of the First Amendment. One that would give states very broad power to shape and distort the marketplace of ideas, and the other that would give legislatures no power at all to regulate the platforms. And the truth is that both of these arguments have real support in the case law. You can find support for these arguments in the case law. But I think it's hugely important that we, think about how we want the First Amendment to apply in this very new context in which private companies control the spaces in which public discourse takes place. I think we need to come up with to develop an understanding of the First Amendment that prevents states from distorting the marketplace of ideas, but creates space for legislation that would actually serve democratic ends. And that seems to me not just a thought process worth engaging in, but the most important thing that First Amendment advocates can do right now is try to come up with a vision of the First Amendment that makes sense in this new context. But I don't think that vision has to or should include new limits on political speech.
I think we're also, that's, so all of that is so important. I would say we're inclined now to ask the First Amendment to do more work than it has ever had to do, partly because, historically the First Amendment is not the only thing that constrains speech in American culture. There are cultural factors that constrain speech. There's community factors, there's family factors, there's religious factors, there's social factors. Speech is what we say to one another and how we behave to people in public discourse is guided by a lot of different codes besides the First Amendment. And, I think in some ways, in recent history, two things have happened. There's been a sort of, maybe you could say, an erosion of the kind of the homogeneity of those codes in communities. But there's also been a real surgence of democratizing speech. There's, people whose speech is now recognized and heard that was never heard before. There is truly diversity of opinion and experience presented in, in the news and literature and in every aspect of American life that wasn't there 50 years ago, that wasn't there 75 years ago. So, I think we need to recognize that, and there were constraints on, that guided how people navigated those, conflicts and edges, usually at the expense of people's speech, outside of First Amendment constraints. So, I think that those social dynamics that have changed the whole speech landscape, have left us with some very, very thorny questions about harmful speech. The harmful speech, I think, was particularly modulated by social factors before. And so, now we're looking to the First Amendment to solve some problems that, the systems that solved them before were highly imperfect, but they're fading, and now we haven't quite found a new way to be a society that understands how we respectfully and, communicate with each other with dignity, that allows difference, promotes tolerance and, understanding and some kind of real give and take of ideas. We're not there yet.
No, but just following on from that, in the Western world, different countries draw the line in different places. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there's a thing called the Race Relations Act. And the Race Relations Act makes it a crime to say things publicly which are considered to be racist. You could be taken to court and you could be sent to jail. As I understand it, the First Amendment would largely protect a lot of the speech that would be outlawed under the Race Relations Act. There are countries in Europe which, because of the World War II experience, criminalized Holocaust denial. Germany, Austria. You can see why. As I understand it, the First Amendment would defend Holocaust denial. So here we have, like 3 major Western democracies which draw the lines in different places. So the question is, are we right? Are there variations in where we draw the line that we should consider? And if so, what might those be?
I think that different societies, different democratic societies can draw these lines in different ways. I don't actually think the sky would fall if we drew this particular line in a slightly different way. I may be an outlier among First Amendment advocates in saying that I grew up in Canada, and that's probably why I'm comfortable with that, that idea. I don't think that the issues we've been talking about today, I'm not sure how many of them actually relate to where that line is drawn. At least in Canada, the category of that particular class of speech that is outlawed in Canada but not outlawed in the United States, it's a pretty narrow category, and has been narrowed further over time. But I'm curious to know your answer, Salman, to this question that you asked us. So you said that you had sort of suggested that you had started to reconsider your previous enthusiasm for Mill and Milton and Madison. Have you? Is there a category of lies that you think we should outlaw?
Well, I'm wrestling with it because I'm actually very deeply a Mill and Milton guy, but I wake up every day and I see this democracy under attack, under attack at its root, and my view is that's a real problem, and we have to think about it in ways that we haven't thought before. I don't have the answer, but What I know is that the problem isn't, I mean, we've been talking very positively and optimistically about the way in which the world functions and the way in which speech contradicts speech and so on and so on. I'm not sure that's experientially what it's like right now. You know, that the lie seems to be more powerful than the truth. You know, there's one of the beliefs that people like John Stuart Mill had was that in a conflict between the truth and the lie, that the truth would always win. The truth would always come through.
He didn't say when, though. Right?
No, but that optimistic view that the truth trumps the lie, sorry about the verb, may not any longer be true. And we know, for example, in Russia today, that most Russians believe the propaganda that's being pushed out at them, and don't see Ukraine as being the victim, but as a Nazi state that has to be cleaned up.
But isn't the Russian example an example of, you know, a society in which truth is imposed from the top down?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, isn't that, you know, precisely why we should be wary of going down that road?
No, I agree. I mean, who guards the guardians
Yeah.
is a very important question. Right? If you bring in rules, who applies those
Yeah.
rules and how do they choose to apply them? You know, but it seems to me to do nothing is also a problem.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the thing?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think, you know, just sort of two thoughts. One is, you're right, it does feel like we're losing this. But I do think, let's take something like the Don't Say Gay, you know, bills and things like that. You know, and these are as close to emotionally violent acts by state legislators as you can get, I think, you know, because you're really talking the Texas law that allows, you know, to prosecution of parents for child abuse, if they have a trans child who's considering transitioning, you know. On the other hand, if you're that child and are considering transitioning, you can go online and you can learn, you know, you can get your experience, explore your experience, understand your experience in a way that trans children have not had in history, you know. So that backlash is there because there's also, you know, there is access to knowledge. So I think, you know, when we see the backlash is strong, the backlash is fierce, the backlash is hurtful and potentially violent, but I think it's because there is a movement in the other direction. As far as the question of hate speech goes, that to me is a question of pure efficacy, you know. I don't think banning speech is a way to stop people from thinking bad thoughts, you know. And I think the rise of you know, ethno-nationalism in Europe, you know, certainly suggests that a model that, you know, prohibits hate speech is perhaps not the solution. You know, I mean, ethno-nationalism is a global phenomenon. It's happening in the United States, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in Italy, you know, happening in Russia, happening in Ukraine. We all have different, we're drawing those lines in different places. But I know if you call somebody a Nazi in the United States right now, you know, that's a badge of honor. You know, that's part of the process of separation into political sex that's happening. And so it seems like an ill-conceived path to
restrict.
To impose.
Okay, let me, before we ask the audience to ask some questions, let me just ask you one thing about reporting. There's a lot online as well as here. There's a lot of young journalists watching, and the question is, how should they think about covering disinformation? I mean, if we distinguish between misinformation, which is involuntary lying, and disinformation, which is deliberate lying. So now, for example, there was a moment when the New York Times started using the word lie to describe what President Trump was saying. Before that, they didn't use that word. So is it that we should, as journalists, that people should call out the lies, or should they not give them what, Margaret Thatcher used this term about the IRA, but not giving it the oxygen of publicity. So the question is, should you ignore it, or should you report it and say what it is? What is the best way to think about reporting this world of disinformation?
I have an opinion on this, and I'm not sure if it stands up or will work. But to me, if you're a reporter and you're reporting about lies, you're reporting about the wrong subject, right? Aren't you supposed to be reporting truth? Aren't you supposed to be looking for truth? Isn't that your job? And so I think if you're getting sucked into writing about lies, you're being suckered. I think you're being diverted from what you really ought to be writing about. And I think, a lot of the conversations, a lot of Trump's lies are strategic. A lot of the political lies are strategic now. It's simply to monopolize the public conversation and to prevent conversation. How many policy questions, serious policy questions, was Trump asked when he was in office? How many policy questions is he asked now if he ever sits down to do an interview? All we're doing is asking him about the big lie. Now, what kind of way is that to hold a public official accountable? They're elected to do a job. So I think job one for reporters is to report stories that reveal truths. Now, and to go down this road is inevitably to write a story about these people say this and these people say this. You can try to push it further and see these people are lying and these people are telling the truth. But there's, what is the issue behind that? Are we talking, if the big lie, what's the big lie about? Well, on a deep fundamental level for democracy, the big lie is about whether or not people's votes are being counted, whether or not we actually have a society that's representing the democratic decision-making of the population. Okay, that's a huge conversation. But I think if you're having the conversation about Trump's big lie, you are selling short the real story about what is the state of American participatory democracy, how is it functioning, who is it representing, how is Congress functioning, how is policy getting made. That's my opinion.
Okay, just to offer the opposite opinion. If there's a monster in the corner coming to eat you, should you ignore it?
I mean, you're right. That is the big question. But that's the monster's game. That's the bully's game, right?
Yeah.
I think this is actually a really complicated question. It's a hard question, and we had to wrestle with one particular version of it when we were litigating these cases about Trump's decision to deplatform some of his critics, block some of his critics from his Twitter account, and then Trump himself, as everybody knows, got deplatformed. And there was this debate about whether the social media platforms were correct to take him down or not. And a lot of people criticized the platforms for. They were criticized from all directions, but one of the criticisms was they had allowed Trump to stay up on the platform even after having repeatedly violated the terms of service. And the view that those people took was, Trump shouldn't be entitled to any lenience. He should be held to the same rules as all other users. And there's an obvious appeal to that, point of view. We filed a comment with the Facebook Oversight Board over this particular issue, and that's not the view we took. The position we took was that with respect to public officials in functioning democracies, the platforms should actually kind of stay their hand as much as possible, not interfere with the speech of the public official, not because the public official is entitled to some special treatment, but rather because citizens need access to that speech in order to evaluate the conduct and judgment of that public official. And it's an interference in an important democratic process for the platforms to make their own decisions about what speech of the president gets distributed to the public. And I think the danger there is that Trump's lies and dangerous speech get amplified, right? And the platforms don't take down speech that causes real harms in the world. But it was our judgment at the time, and I still think that this is the right view, that that's a cost of democracy. That it's really important that citizens know that the president is telling a lie. If the president's telling a lie, it's really important that citizens have access to the president's speech and have the ability to evaluate that speech for themselves without it being mediated by by the platforms. And but we struggled with that then, and I think it's a closely related question to the one that you asked.
What about, just to take Trump out of the subject line for a minute, what about, for example, the kind of disinformation that was spread about COVID and about the vaccines, which are enormously harmful, almost certainly resulted in the deaths of some significant numbers of people who need not have died if they had not been lied to?
So is the question, what should the platforms do, or is it what should reporters do?
Well, I meant what should the platforms do, since that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of labeling. I think that the platform should label that speech as misinformation. They should point people to accurate information. They should make it clear that they themselves believe that this is a lie, but they shouldn't take it down. I also think that there are other ways you can prevent the speech from being shared, from being amplified. That's another way of not taking the speech down, but mitigating the harms that it might cause. I think there are things they can do other than remove the speech entirely from the digital public sphere.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the original question, which is what should journalists do, and I'm thinking more of what we think of as journalists and journalism versus the platforms. The platforms are enormously lucrative models that become more lucrative the more controversial the material is. That's their game is engagement. Their game is controversy. It's difficult. The platforms have little interest in patrolling and policing speech because Alex Jones is. He has his whatever it is, YouTube, is that where he is? And then, he's got his channels, but then, the amount of times that he's retweeted by Twitter, not just by the right, but by the left, who are engaging with him and using that to, for our own conversations about how crazy those people are. That's the stuff that Twitter runs on. That's its juice. And, so I don't think it's realistic to even imagine that they have any interest in controlling that at all. That's their business.
Okay, let's if we've got some questions coming down the pike. Suketu, Mehta, do you want?
It's over there.
That was quite fascinating. So I have a question about the use of libel laws in fighting lies. Alex Jones, that you mentioned, was InfoWars just declared bankruptcy because the parents of the Sandy Hook survivors sued them into bankruptcy for lying. Dominion voter systems, like one letter from their lawyer, accomplish more than all the reporting about election lies. A letter from the lawyers to Fox News and Newsmax and so forth, and they were, on air publicly recounting their lives. So, so do you think that this could be used more? And here too, is there a danger of overreach? So in Britain, for example, libel laws are used to really clamp down on free speech or even just unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I was glad to see that particular libel case, and I don't see that as a threat to free speech, but rather a kind of guarantor of a healthy speech ecosystem. But in the United States, as you know, there's constitutional limits to defamation actions since 1964. The Supreme Court, has held to the view that individuals can't recover for defamation unless they can meet relatively high hurdles, actual malice with respect to public officials or public figures. And so, your defamation might play a useful role, but it's not going to play a very large role. Also, defamation actions always involve an individual who's been harmed, but many of the lies we've been talking about, the harm is much more diffuse. It's hard to identify the individual who's been harmed by the big lie, right? So I don't think defamation is going to be an answer to that, that particular concern. I think it can be part of the answer, but not all of it.
Are there any, I don't know, Steve, are you there, if there's questions coming down?
Yeah, so we have a couple questions. There has been some attempts to disbar lawyers who have been involved in the big lie. Do you support that kind of control of false speech?
That's a question for me.
I have an opinion, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what the speech was and whether the speech was made. I mean, I think some of those cases involved speech that was made to courts, right? It was speech in legal briefs. And I think that policing lawyers for their statements to courts is an important thing. It's important to the integrity of the judicial process. The courts need to, be confident that what lawyers are telling them about the world, reflects what lawyers actually believe about the world. I think there are some dangers there. You could imagine a situation where that kind of policing ran up against legitimate political speech. But if you are a lawyer telling a court that 50,000 people voted and that 90,000 people voted, then it doesn't offend my free speech sensibilities if a court holds you, or the Bar Association holds you accountable for it.
I would agree with that. I would, and the last word I think is the most important part of that, which is that, there is a question of accountability. And one of the problems that sort of, that permeates this discussion and many discussions is, failures of accountability mechanisms or weaknesses of accountability mechanisms, or how are people held responsible, for what they say and what they do. And, I would say, bar associations, that falls into the category of what I was talking about before, which were non-First Amendment institutions that to some extent modulate, the way people act and speak in public, and the way professional standards and those things, you're accountable to your professional associations. And so, I think it certainly, if you remove that, you're removing something that's historically been there. We're saying that, it doesn't, there won't be accountability within your profession for betraying some of the basic principles and pledges of your profession. That seems like, only going to raise more difficulties. So I think, again, that's different from asking the First Amendment to do it. It's different from asking the government to punish lawyers who do this. But if lawyers want to punish lawyers for doing this, I'm all for it.
But it's important to say that they were punished, the ones who were disbarred, for things they had said in court, not for things they had just generally said.
Right. But that's a violation of a clear professional standard, right?
So as a follow-up, a lawyer could be potentially disbarred for lying in legal documents or in open court, but saying the same things outside of court, exactly the same things, would basically be protected. Is that right?
Well, so let me start by saying I haven't given a ton of thought to this particular set of questions, but that's my instinct. My instinct is that when lawyers are talking to the public, they're participating in political discourse, in public discourse, and they should be entitled to the same protections as everyone else. When they're speaking to courts, they're officers of the courts, they're operating in their professional capacities. Now, that line, I think, is a little bit blurry. What if you're talking to the world about the case you're litigating in court? But at least my first instinct is to draw a line between speech made to, to courts and speech made to the public.
Okay. We have a question. What truly defines a lie in journalism? Is it the intentional or unintentional spread of incorrect information, or presenting information through a narrow or biased point of view?
Well, a lie is intentional. A lie is not, it's not something that arises out of not knowing. A lie is deliberate. We all know when we're lying. And so a lie is always done intentionally. And if it's done intentionally with with a desire to harm, then it's a problem. I mean, as you were saying, lots of us lie all the time. And it's nobody's business. But when there is a public lie deliberately made with intention to harm, then it becomes a subject.
I think that's true. I think it's, it becomes complicated for journalists who are also advocates sometimes, and it's very difficult to, the idea of impartial journalism, as opposed to, journalism that's meant to make an impact, to expose truths to things. And so, the way you construct stories and who you interview and, how you arrange your quotes and, all of those things. I mean, there's a high degree of artifice to the way that you construct journalism, and I mean, you know this. And so, it's possible to be, the really, really good journalist, is a novelist in some ways, is a I don't want to say fiction writer, because I think fiction writers are truth tellers, in a very serious way. So I think, it's a hugely complicated question. But I think, Salman, the line that you draw, which is if you deliberately, are presenting something that you know not to be true, that's a bright line.
I mean, in many contexts, it doesn't really matter, right? Whether it's a lie or just wrong. It matters when the character of the speaker is at issue, right? And so if you're talking about Trump or Biden, then maybe it does matter whether they got something wrong or they're lying, because it should matter to ordinary citizens whether their president is, operating in good faith or not. But in many situations, like, the relevant question isn't whether this random person spouting misinformation about vaccines is lying or just wrong, right? The relevant piece of information, the one that any story should focus on, is just the wrongness of the, and maybe there's some danger to being distracted by this question of intent in situations where intent is actually not really that important. The important piece of information is that this thing being presented as the truth is not in fact the truth.
And you mentioned actually a really important situation, that the WMD case, if you're reporting on something that you're really actually, just a conduit for government lies, and those lies are enormously consequential, obviously that, we can debate till the end of time whether those journalists were useful idiots or knew better or whatever, but in point of fact, they retold lies that had enormous consequences. So,
I mean, I do think in general, the position of the journalist as the guardian of the truth is a way to think about it. And what you were saying earlier, that the important thing is to report things that are so, rather than magnify things that are not so. And so, I mean, I do think that journalism and literature have that in common, that they both move towards the truth. They move towards some kind of telling of the truth. And that's what they're for. And I would certainly urge any young journalists listening to this that they should see the world or their world in that way?
I think of literature as the space between the law and actual human behavior, and so the idea of what the First Amendment can and can't do here, and what we're asking it to do. Law can do some things, but people are going to behave in complex, paradoxical, complicated ways, and so the truth of literature is that space between the two.
You want the last word, Jameel?
I'm not sure. I was just thinking in relation to that particular exchange that the law is, among other things, a means of arriving at truth, just like literature is. It's a different means, obviously, and maybe less successful often at actually getting where we want to go. But these are just different ways of arriving at something that we will in the end agree to treat as as true, and maybe to the extent we're all concerned right now about the fact that we don't seem to be able to arrive at a collective truth is at least in part about the failure of this legal process, the failure of the law to give us a mechanism for getting from a state of kind of confusion and dispute to a place where we at least are willing to agree to political truths, that these are the things that we have agreed to treat as true. So maybe there's a failure here on the part of poets and novelists, but also lawyers.
Okay, that's a good place to start. Well, thank you both. It's been really great having you here, and we're out of time. Thank you, everybody who's listening, and good night.
Thanks,
Thank
Salman.
you.
Thank you, everyone.